If you are learning React and having a hard time to understand how some of the most frequently used hooks work, this video is for you. In this video, I'm going to be explaining these 5 hooks with examples. Let's get started. Let's start with useState. useState is a hook that allows you to add state to your functional components. So what does state mean if you ask? Let me explain with examples. Let's say we are building a tic-tac-toe game. Each time a player clicks on the squares, we need to make sure that those squares remember the value they carry. In this case, it's X or O. If the squares doesn't have state, they won't be able to remember their values. So each time you click on a square, the previous one's value would disappear, and we don't want that to happen. So basically, what we are going to do is, we put useState hook into those square components in order to store this data and make the component remember it. In this way, as the game goes on, the value you put into those squares by clicking on them will remain as you keep clicking. Another example would be a dark mode button. By clicking on it, you basically change a state, which is in this case the styling of the website. To have a better understanding, let's make this button increase the number below it by adding useState to it. First, you need to import useState from React at the top, and you should call it at the top level of your component like this. useState returns an array with 2 values. The first one is the current value, and the second one is a set function that updates the first one in case of a value change. And inside the parentheses, you set the default value. The convention is to name these variables by something, set something, to make it easier to understand what these values mean. So you can name them whatever you want. In this case, it's count and set count because we are going to use it to increase the count, so it makes sense. We also need a click handler function that we can pass into that button, so that when you click on it, you call the set count function and update the count by +1 like this. Again, you can name those functions whatever you want. So finally, we are going to add a onClick event handler into this button and pass the click handler function into it. And as you can see, every time we click, useState re-renders the component and changes the state, which in this case, it increases the number below. Now that we understand how useState works, let's move on to the next one, useEffect. useEffect allows you to run side effects in your functional components. You use it by calling useEffect and passing a function that contains the side effect. Side effects are not predictable because they are actions which are performed with the outside world. We perform a side effect when we need to reach outside of our React components to do something, like fetching data from an API or manipulate the DOM. In this example, we are fetching data using Axios inside useEffect and storing the data inside users using useState at the top. Let's take a look at what useEffect does. The first part is where we declare the side effect, and the second part, the empty brackets, means the effect should only run once when the component mounts. Inside the side effect, we fetch data from a JSON API, and we handle the response and error. And finally, we display the fetched data that's stored in users by mapping over it as list items inside an unordered list. And that's how useEffect works. Moving on to the next one, useContext. useContext is basically a data storage, a hook that makes it easier to share data between components, like settings or user information. When you have a lot of components and information in your application, it gets harder to pass data one by one, and it's even harder to share it through multiple levels of component props. This is what useContext is for. You start by creating a context that will store the data that you want to pass to the other components. In this case, let's say we want to pass a dark mode. At the top of your component tree, choose the highest component, like your app component. Use context.provider to provide the data. In this case, we will provide the current theme. Whenever you want to make a component to consume that data, you can use the useContext to access it. It's like pulling data from that central storage. And another thing that you should know about useContext is you don't have to use it in small applications that doesn't have multiple levels of components. When your component tree gets bigger, that's when you should use useContext. Moving on to the next one, useReducer. useReducer is a hook that allows you to manage state in just a bit more complex way than useState. In React, you often have some state data that you need to update frequently, like a counter or a form's input values. useState is good for this kind of simple cases, but when things start to get more complicated, it can be hard to manage. To explain it, let's use a basic example. Remember the button that uses useState to increase count? Let's add a decrease button to it using useReducer. First, we define the reducer function, giving it two arguments as input, state and action. State is the current state, and action is just an object that describes what kind of change you want to make to your state. Until this point, it looks similar to useState. Inside the function, we use switch to handle multiple states. In this case, we are going to handle increase and decrease. We also need to create a counter component, giving it the useReducer hook with the two arguments, state and dispatch, and set the default count to 0. And again, state is the current state and the dispatch is basically for to dispatch the actions to the reducer function that we created. And finally, we pass the reducer functions inside onClick. And as you can see, it works beautifully. So this is how useReducer works. You can use it when you need to store and handle multiple state changes like this. Moving on to the next one, useRef. useRef is a hook that allows you to create a mutable value that will keep the same reference between renders. The most important part about useRef is it doesn't trigger a re-render when the value changes. If we use the increase button example again, using useRef this time, when you click on the button, you will notice that the count doesn't change. Because, as I said, useRef doesn't trigger a re-render to update the user interface. So this will be useful when you need the value to stay the same when the page gets re-rendered. The most common case for using useRef is when you need to grab an HTML element from the DOM. In this example, we use useRef to create a reference called inputRef, and this will hold a reference to the input element. We render an input field and set the ref attribute to inputRef. We also render a button which calls the focus input function. Inside this function, we can use inputRef.current to focus on the input element. This creates a direct access to the DOM element, and it's the most common use case for useRef. And that's how the 5 most frequently used React hooks work. If you find this video helpful, consider subscribing and liking the video. Thank you for watching and see you next time.